November 18th, 1942. Staging area positioned along the eastern bank of the Don River, 60 kilometers northwest of Stalingrad. The temperature holds steady at 15 degrees below freezing, and the ground maintains a layer of frost that refuses to melt even during daylight hours. Across 3 kilometers of open steppe, Soviet artillery units assemble in positions carefully concealed from German reconnaissance aircraft by strategically positioned camouflage netting and the natural depressions characteristic of the landscape. The guns themselves represent the standard Soviet arsenal available at this stage of the war: 76mm divisional guns, 122mm howitzers, and the heavier 152mm pieces specifically designed to crack concrete fortifications and shatter defensive positions. But the vehicles pulling those guns tell an entirely different story. American-built Studebaker US-6 trucks stand arranged in neat rows beside Soviet artillery pieces, their distinctive grills and cab shapes impossible to mistake for domestic production. Each truck carries Cyrillic markings painted hastily over the original English lettering, and Soviet stars replace the white stars that marked them during their journey across the Atlantic Ocean. The drivers who operate these vehicles received them only weeks earlier, with minimal documentation and instructions translated hastily from English technical manuals into Russian. They learned through direct experience that these trucks start reliably in temperatures that kill Soviet Gazi and ZIS models completely, that their suspensions handle cratered roads without breaking axles every 50 kilometers, and that their engines run for thousands of kilometers between mechanical failures that would disable domestic vehicles. Colonel Dmitry Sokolov commands an artillery regiment assigned to the Southwestern Front's portion of Operation Uranus, the planned encirclement of German forces at Stalingrad. His orders specify movement schedules that require his guns to displace rapidly once the offensive begins, advancing 50 to 70 kilometers in the first 48 hours to maintain relentless pressure on retreating German units. 6 months earlier, such orders would have been completely impossible to execute. The Red Army entered the war with approximately 272,000 trucks of all types, and by autumn 1942, combat losses and mechanical breakdowns reduced that fleet to perhaps half its original strength at best. Moving an artillery regiment meant requisitioning civilian vehicles using horses or leaving guns immobilized because no transport existed whatsoever. Now, Sokolov's regiment operates entirely mobile. Every gun has its assigned Studebaker. Every ammunition trailer connects to American-built transport. The trucks arrive through Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, unloaded from Liberty ships that survived German U-boat patrols and Luftwaffe attacks to deliver their cargo to Soviet ports. From there, the vehicles traveled south by rail and road, distributed to units preparing for the winter counter-offensive, with priority given to mobile formations and artillery units, whose effectiveness depended entirely on rapid displacement capability. The political officers attached to Sokolov's regiment deliver careful instructions about acknowledging this equipment publicly. In written reports, the trucks appear as automotive transport without specifying origin or manufacturer. In conversations with troops, officers emphasize Soviet productive capacity and the heroic efforts of workers in relocated factories. The word American appears nowhere in official documentation, despite the undeniable fact that every vehicle in the regiment came from factories in Detroit and South Bend, Indiana. This omission extends systematically across the entire Red Army. American trucks move Soviet divisions forward, American jeeps transport Soviet commanders, and American locomotives pull trains carrying Soviet ammunition to the front. But the official narrative maintains firmly that the USSR fights this war with its own resources, dependent on no one. Sokolov understands the contradiction perfectly because he commanded artillery in 1941 during the initial German invasion. He remembers guns abandoned on roadsides because no trucks existed to tow them westward. He remembers artillery regiments reduced to static positions because movement meant losing equipment entirely. He remembers the desperate improvisations, civilian trucks requisitioned from collective farms, wooden carts pulled by horses, even tractors pressed into service despite mechanical unreliability and fuel consumption that exceeded supply capacity. The Red Army entered the war with mobility measured in horse-drawn kilometers per day and found itself facing German mechanized divisions that moved at 40 kilometers per hour on paved roads. The American trucks changed that calculus fundamentally. A Studebaker US-6 carries 5 tons of cargo or tows a 122-millimeter howitzer across terrain that would strand a Soviet ZIS-5 completely. The suspension systems handle the punishment of roads cratered by artillery and tracked vehicles. The engines start in temperatures that freeze Soviet vehicles into complete immobility. The fuel efficiency means longer operational ranges without resupply. These advantages translate directly into combat effectiveness on the battlefield. Artillery that can displace rapidly survives counter-battery fire from German guns. Units that maintain mobility can exploit breakthroughs before German forces stabilize defensive lines, and logistics trains that function reliably keep ammunition and supplies flowing steadily to frontline forces. But acknowledging this dependency creates political problems that Stalin's government simply cannot accept. Soviet propaganda emphasizes the motherland's strength, the invincibility of Soviet socialism, and the inevitable triumph of the working class over fascist imperialism. Admitting that American capitalist production provides the wheels on which the Red Army rolls contradicts that narrative fundamentally. Admitting that Soviet industry cannot produce sufficient trucks to equip the Army suggests weakness and inadequacy. Admitting dependence on Western aid implies that victory comes not from Soviet strength alone, but from coalition support and foreign assistance. So the trucks remain unmarked in official records. Supply manifests list automotive transport without manufacturer details. Soldiers drive American vehicles painted with Soviet stars and instructed explicitly to credit Soviet factories for their equipment. The contradiction exists in plain sight for anyone willing to observe. Mechanics work on engines designed in Detroit. Drivers read translated manuals, and anyone with eyes can see the distinctive features of American manufacturers. But the official silence remains absolute and unbroken. Sokolov watches his regiment prepare for the offensive scheduled to begin before dawn the following morning. The guns are positioned correctly, ammunition stockpiled in sufficient quantities, and Studebakers ready to move the moment orders arrive. He knows precisely what these trucks mean for operational capability. He knows that without them, this offensive would require weeks of additional preparation and accept far lower operational tempo. He knows that American production has fundamentally altered Soviet military capability in ways that Moscow acknowledges privately while denying publicly. The temperature continues dropping steadily as darkness settles over the steppe. Engine fires burn in carefully shielded positions where mechanics keep vehicles warm enough to start on command when needed. The offensive will begin in hours, and when it does, American trucks will carry Soviet artillery through the encirclement of German forces at Stalingrad in an operation that becomes a turning point in the war. But the Americans who built these trucks will never know their contribution to Soviet victory. The workers in Detroit and South Bend who assembled these vehicles will never see them in Soviet service, and the official Soviet history being written even as the battle unfolds will credit Soviet production, Soviet ingenuity, and Soviet strength alone for victory achieved with wheels that rolled off assembly lines 5,000 miles from the steppe, where they now wait to advance into combat. November 19th, 1942, dawn breaks over the Don River positions. The artillery barrage begins precisely on schedule, and Sokolov's regiment contributes its portion to the bombardment that tears into German defensive positions with devastating effect. The sound rolls across the frozen steppe like continuous thunder, and the muzzle flashes create an artificial sunrise across the entire front. Within hours, Soviet infantry and tank formations breached German lines at multiple points, and the encirclement operation proceeds according to plan. 4 days later, the pincers close, trapping the German Sixth Army inside Stalingrad with no route for withdrawal or resupply remaining open. Sokolov's guns advance exactly as ordered. The Studebakers pull artillery pieces forward at speeds that would have been absolutely impossible with Soviet trucks or horse-drawn transport. When German resistance hardens at defensive positions, the regiment displaces laterally, finds new firing positions, and resumes bombardment without losing operational tempo. The trucks navigate mud created by unseasonably warm weather that arrives midway through the offensive, conditions that would have trapped Soviet vehicles axle deep and immobilized entire units completely. The American suspensions and drivetrain configurations handle the terrain, and the offensive maintains momentum. This pattern repeats across the entire southwestern and Stalingrad fronts. American trucks move Soviet divisions at mechanical speeds rather than biological ones. Artillery remains mobile instead of static. Supply columns maintain flow instead of breaking down and creating logistical bottlenecks that strangle advances. The encirclement succeeds in part because Soviet forces can move faster than German commanders anticipate, exploiting breakthroughs before defensive positions solidify. But Stalingrad represents only one sector of a front that stretches from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea, and trucks constitute only one category of American Lend-Lease deliveries, transforming Soviet military capability fundamentally. December 1942, the Kremlin, Moscow. Stalin receives reports detailing Lend-Lease deliveries accumulated over 18 months since Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. The numbers exist in classified documents that circulate only among highest-level leadership and economic planning committees. These reports never appear in newspapers, never get discussed in public speeches, and never inform the narrative Soviet citizens hear about how the motherland prosecutes the war. The truck figures alone reshape Soviet logistics fundamentally. By the end of 1942, approximately 184,000 American vehicles have arrived through Arctic convoy routes and Persian corridor supply lines. This number will grow to 427,000 by war's end, more trucks than the entire Soviet Union possessed when Germany invaded. The American vehicles don't just supplement Soviet production, they replace it entirely in mobile formations. By 1943, the majority of Soviet artillery, mechanized infantry, and supply units operate on American wheels. But the transformation extends far beyond trucks alone. American locomotives and railway cars address critical rail transport bottlenecks. The Soviet rail system operates on different gauge than European railways, and German forces systematically destroy Soviet rolling stock during their initial advance and subsequent retreats. American deliveries of 1,900 locomotives and 11,000 railway cars restore capacity to move ammunition, fuel, and supplies from relocated factories in the Urals to frontline positions. Without these locomotives, the distances involved in Soviet logistics would strangle offensive operations regardless of truck availability. The aviation fuel figures appear particularly sensitive in Stalin's classified reports. Soviet refineries produce aviation gasoline of insufficient octane rating for high-performance aircraft engines. American deliveries of high-octane fuel literally keep Soviet fighters and ground attack aircraft operational. The Ilyushin Il-2 Shturmovik ground attack aircraft and Yakovlev fighters that dominate battlefields from 1943 onward fly on American fuel refined in Texas and shipped across the Atlantic in tankers that run German submarine gauntlets. Then there are the seemingly mundane items that prove strategically essential. 15 million pairs of boots keep Soviet soldiers marching through winter campaigns. The Red Army entered the war with inadequate footwear production, and frostbite casualties in the first winter exceeded combat losses in some units. American boots mean soldiers maintain operational effectiveness in temperatures that previously incapacitated entire divisions. 5 million tons of food supplies supplement Soviet agricultural production decimated by German occupation of Ukraine and disruption of collective farm systems. Telephone wire, copper, aluminum, explosives, machine tools. The list extends across dozens of categories representing industrial capacity. The Soviet Union cannot generate domestically while simultaneously fighting total war. Stalin's relationship with this dependency remains complex and contradictory. He understands the strategic necessity clearly. Soviet industry relocated east of the Urals focuses on tank and artillery production, because those weapons cannot be imported effectively across vast distances. American productive capacity fills gaps Soviet factories cannot address while maintaining weapons production. This division of labor makes operational sense. Let American industry provide trucks and locomotives while Soviet factories build T-34 tanks and Katyusha rocket launchers. But acknowledging this arrangement publicly contradicts Soviet ideological foundations. The entire communist narrative rests on Soviet superiority, on the inevitable triumph of socialism over capitalism, on the strength of the working class and the invincibility of the motherland. Admitting that Soviet survival depends on American capitalist production undermines that narrative. It suggests weakness rather than strength. It implies that victory comes through Western aid rather than Soviet sacrifice and determination alone. So Stalin maintains the contradiction carefully. Privately, he accepts Lend-Lease as essential. He pushes for increased deliveries, through diplomatic channels. He assigns high-priority rail capacity to move American supplies from ports to frontline units. Soviet generals plan operations based on American truck availability and fuel supplies. The entire Soviet war effort from 1943 onward operates on a foundation of American logistics. But publicly, the silence remains absolute. Soviet newspapers describe victories without mentioning the trucks that made rapid advances possible. Newsreels show Soviet soldiers without highlighting their American boots. Propaganda emphasizes Soviet tank production while ignoring that American aluminum enables aircraft construction and American machine tools increase factory output. The archival reports Stalin reviews contain statistical realities that must never become public knowledge. By late 1942, American Lend-Lease provides approximately 12% of Soviet industrial production by value. This percentage grows as war continues. The trucks, locomotives, aviation fuel, and food represent capabilities Soviet economy cannot generate while simultaneously maintaining weapons production and feeding population under wartime conditions. Marshal Georgy Zhukov understands these realities from an operational perspective. As Deputy Supreme Commander and Stalin's primary troubleshooter for critical sectors, Zhukov sees how American supplies enable Soviet offensives. He watches artillery regiments move at speeds impossible without Studebakers. He observes supply columns that maintain flow using American trucks that don't break down every 100 kilometers. He notes that offensive operations planned in Moscow succeed in field execution, partly because American logistics make the planning assumptions viable. Zhukov's post-war memoirs, written decades later under different political circumstances, acknowledge what wartime propaganda concealed. Without American trucks, Soviet artillery remains largely immobile. Without American locomotives, supplies never reach frontline units in quantities needed for sustained operations. Without American aviation fuel, Soviet Air Force effectiveness drops dramatically. These admissions come years after Stalin's death, when political circumstances permit limited acknowledgement of wartime realities. But in 1942 and 1943, as the war's tide turns from desperate defense to methodical counteroffensive, the contradiction persists. American supplies flow through Murmansk, Arkhangelsk, and the Persian Corridor. Soviet units incorporate this equipment into their standard organization. Operations succeed partly because logistics function on American wheels and rails. Yet the official narrative maintains complete silence about these contributions, crediting Soviet strength alone for victories achieved through coalition support. The political officers embedded in every unit enforce the silence strictly. Soldiers know they drive American trucks, but they learn not to mention it in letters home. Officers file reports using euphemistic language that obscures equipment origins. The entire Red Army operates under instructions to acknowledge American aid minimally, if at all, maintaining the fiction of Soviet self-sufficiency even as reality demonstrates profound dependency. June 23, 1944. Staging areas along the Dnieper River, Belarusian front. Operation Bagration prepares to launch the largest Soviet offensive since the war began, an assault designed to destroy German Army Group Center and liberate Belarusia. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky commands the 1st Belarusian Front, one of 4 fronts coordinating the operation. His forces include 1.2 million soldiers, 4,000 tanks, and 24,000 artillery pieces. The operational plan requires unprecedented mobility. Breakthrough forces must advance 350 kilometers in 3 weeks, maintaining tempo that prevents German forces from establishing coherent defensive lines. The logistics for this operation rest almost entirely on American wheels. Rokossovsky's front operates approximately 15,000 trucks, and nearly all are Studebakers, Dodges, and Willys Jeeps delivered through Lend-Lease. Soviet truck production in 1944 focuses primarily on replacement parts for existing vehicles rather than new construction, as factory capacity prioritizes tank and self-propelled gun production. The American trucks don't supplement Soviet logistics. They constitute Soviet logistics entirely. Every artillery piece in the opening barrage will be pulled by American trucks. Every ammunition resupply column will move on American chassis. Every tank brigade's fuel and supply train will follow on American wheels. The wounded will evacuate in American-built ambulances. Command posts will displace using American vehicles. The entire operational concept depends on mobility that Soviet industrial production cannot provide. Rokossovsky's staff officers plan the offensive using mathematical calculations based on American truck performance characteristics. They know Studebakers maintain average road speeds of 40 kilometers per hour on decent surfaces and 25 on damaged roads. They calculate fuel consumption rates based on Detroit engineering specifications. They estimate maintenance intervals using American service schedules. The offensive timeline exists because American trucks make it achievable. German intelligence completely misassesses Soviet capability, partly because they underestimate this logistical transformation. Wehrmacht analysis assumes Soviet mobility remains constrained by limited truck availability and unreliable mechanical performance. German commanders expect Soviet offensives to slow after initial breakthroughs as supply lines overextend and logistics collapse. This assumption proved correct in 1941 and 1942 when Soviet forces advanced beyond their logistical capacity and stalled. But 1944 operates under different mathematics. American trucks extend Soviet supply reach by factors of 2 or 3 compared to pre-Lend-Lease capability. Maintenance reliability means fewer vehicles breaking down during critical advances. Payload capacity allows each truck to carry more ammunition and fuel per trip. These advantages compound. Better trucks mean fewer vehicles needed for same logistics output, which means less fuel consumed in transport, which extends operational range further. Operation Bagration launches on schedule, and the results validate the logistics planning completely. Soviet forces break through German defensive positions on the first day. Within 72 hours, multiple German divisions find themselves encircled as Soviet mobile units advance faster than Wehrmacht commanders believe possible. The offensive maintains momentum for 3 weeks, advancing exactly as planned because supply columns keep ammunition and fuel flowing to advancing units. German defensive doctrine assumes Soviet offensives exhaust themselves through logistics failures, frontline units outrun their supplies, fuel runs short, ammunition depletes, and attacks stall. This pattern held true throughout 1941 and 1942. But in Bagration, Soviet units maintained supply, even while advancing 300 kilometers, because American trucks can sustain the operational tempo. The Red Army demonstrates mobility previously associated only with German mechanized forces. The operation destroys Army Group Center as an effective fighting force. 28 German divisions cease to exist. Over 350,000 German casualties accumulate in 3 weeks. Soviet forces liberate all of Belorussia and advance to the borders of Poland. The victory represents one of the war's most devastating defeats inflicted on German military forces, comparable in scale to Stalingrad, but accomplished through maneuver rather than encirclement, and the entire operation rolls forward on American wheels that officially don't exist in Soviet military narrative. August 1944, Tehran Conference aftermath discussions, the Kremlin. Churchill presses Stalin on the question of Lend-Lease acknowledgement during private meetings. The British Prime Minister suggests that public recognition of Allied aid would strengthen coalition unity and demonstrate Western commitment to Soviet survival. Stalin's response remains carefully non-committal. He acknowledges the value of supplies and private conversation while avoiding any commitment to public statements. The political calculation driving Stalin's position involves both domestic and international considerations. Domestically, the Soviet population has endured 3 years of total war through narrative emphasizing Soviet strength and inevitable victory. Introducing Western aid as critical factor complicates that narrative. It raises questions about why aid was necessary if Soviet system remained superior to capitalism. It suggests dependence rather than independence. Internationally, Stalin positions the Soviet Union for post-war status as superpower rival to the United States and Britain. Acknowledging wartime dependency on American production undermines that positioning. It establishes precedent of Soviet weakness and Western strength that contradicts the power balance Stalin intends to project after Germany's defeat. But privately, in meetings with Soviet military leadership and economic planners, Stalin demonstrates clear understanding of Lend-Lease's strategic importance. He reviews shipping schedules for convoy routes. He prioritizes rail capacity for moving American supplies from ports to frontline units. He personally approves requests for specific equipment categories when Soviet generals identify operational needs that domestic production cannot fulfill. Marshal Zhukov participates in these classified discussions and observes Stalin's contradictory positions firsthand. The Soviet leader, who publicly credits Soviet strength alone for victories, privately ensures that American trucks, fuel, and locomotives receive absolute priority in logistics planning. The disconnect between public narrative and private reality becomes so pronounced that senior military officers learn to operate in both spheres simultaneously, acknowledging Lend-Lease's importance in classified planning while maintaining public silence. The scope of American deliveries by mid-1944 reaches proportions that reshape Soviet military capability fundamentally, beyond the 427,000 trucks that become the most visible symbol of aid. The United States provides 1,900 locomotives that restore Soviet rail transport capacity destroyed during German occupation. Soviet railways operate as the war effort's circulatory system, moving supplies from factory to front across distances measuring thousands of kilometers. American locomotives and rail cars make this system function. Aviation fuel deliveries total 2.7 million tons by war's end, and this fuel keeps Soviet Air Force operational. Soviet refineries cannot produce aviation gasoline meeting octane requirements for high-performance aircraft engines. American fuel enables Soviet fighters to maintain engine performance, Soviet ground attack aircraft to support advancing ground forces, and Soviet bombers to strike German rear areas. Without this fuel, Soviet air operations would decline dramatically, regardless of aircraft production. Food supplies total 5 million tons, and these shipments supplement Soviet agricultural production devastated by German occupation of Ukraine and disruption of collective farming systems. Soviet soldiers march on American rations more often than Soviet propaganda admits. The Spam and powdered eggs become so ubiquitous that veterans remember them decades later, though official histories never mention American food keeping Soviet armies fed. Telephone wire, copper, aluminum, machine tools, explosives. Every category of industrial material arrives through Lend-Lease channels. American aluminum enables Soviet aircraft production at scales otherwise impossible. American machine tools increase factory output. American explosives supplement Soviet ammunition production. The cumulative effect creates Soviet military capability that exceeds what domestic production alone could generate while simultaneously fighting total war. Soviet economic planners understand these dependencies with precision unavailable to public discourse. They track exactly which American supplies enable which Soviet capabilities. They calculate what domestic production could achieve without Lend-Lease and recognize the gaps. They plan post-war industrial development around lessons learned about Soviet productive weaknesses exposed by wartime dependence on American aid. But this knowledge remains classified at highest levels. The Red Army soldier driving his Studebaker knows he operates American equipment, but learns not to discuss it. The pilot flying on American fuel understands his engine requires it, but files no reports mentioning this dependency. The artillery officer whose guns move on American trucks writes after-action reports that credit Soviet logistics without specifying how those logistics function. The entire system operates through structured silence. Everyone knows, no one speaks, and official history records only Soviet strength achieving Soviet victories through Soviet means. The contradiction becomes so normalized that participants navigate it automatically, maintaining separate spheres of acknowledged reality depending on context and audience. January 12, 1945. Vistula River bridgeheads, First Ukrainian Front. The final Soviet offensive toward Germany begins from positions in Poland, and the scale of forces assembled demonstrates how completely American logistics transformed Soviet military capability. Marshal Ivan Konev commands First Ukrainian Front with orders to drive through Poland and into Germany itself, advancing 500 kilometers in 6 weeks. His forces number 1.8 million soldiers, supported by 6,000 tanks and 32,000 artillery pieces. The offensive requires moving this entire mass forward at sustained operational tempo, while maintaining ammunition and fuel supply across distances that would have been impossible to manage in 1941 or 1942. The Studebakers and Dodges move everything. Artillery pieces advance on American suspension systems that handle Polish roads cratered by 3 years of combat. Ammunition trucks follow closely behind advancing infantry, maintaining shell supply to guns firing continuous barrages. Fuel tankers keep tank brigades mobile despite consumption rates exceeding 50 tons per day for armored divisions. Medical evacuation proceeds in American-built ambulances that transport wounded from field hospitals to rear area facilities. Soviet soldiers joke privately about their American horses and the reliability of vehicles that start in minus 30-degree temperatures, while Soviet trucks sit frozen and useless. Maintenance crews work with translated technical manuals and spare parts shipped from Detroit, learning American mechanical systems because no alternative exists. The Red Army has become so dependent on American logistics that entire operational concepts now assume American equipment availability. The offensive proceeds exactly as planned, advancing through Poland at speeds German forces cannot match in their retreat. Soviet spearheads reached German territory in East Prussia within 2 weeks, maintaining momentum because logistics keep pace with frontline advances. The contrast with earlier Soviet offensives remained stark. In 1941, Soviet counterattacks stalled within days as supplies ran out and trucks broke down. In 1945, offensives sustained themselves for weeks across hundreds of kilometers because American equipment functions reliably under conditions that destroy Soviet vehicles. But the official narrative being constructed, even as these battles unfold, maintains complete silence about this dependency. Soviet war correspondents file dispatches describing Red Army advances without mentioning the trucks carrying soldiers forward. Propaganda emphasizes Soviet tank production while ignoring that American aluminum enables aircraft factories to meet output quotas. The newspapers celebrated throughout liberated territories credit Soviet strength alone for victories achieved through coalition logistics. May 1945, Yalta Conference conclusions, the Kremlin. Stalin reviews final Lend-Lease delivery statistics as Germany collapses and the European war approaches conclusion. The numbers represent transformation so complete that Soviet military capability without American support becomes difficult to calculate. Over the war's duration, the United States delivered 427,000 trucks and jeeps, more vehicles than the entire Soviet Union possessed in June 1941, constituting roughly 2/3 of Soviet truck inventory by war's end. 13,000 locomotives and 11,000 railway cars, replacing destroyed Soviet rolling stock and enabling rail transport system to function across distances measuring thousands of kilometers. 2.7 million tons of aviation fuel, keeping Soviet Air Force operational when domestic refineries cannot produce adequate octane ratings. 15 million pairs of boots, enough to outfit the entire Red Army twice over. 5 million tons of food, supplementing agricultural production and feeding soldiers advancing through devastated territories. Beyond these major categories, American deliveries included 380,000 field telephones and 1 million miles of telephone wire that enabled Soviet communications networks to function. American machine tools increased Soviet factory output by percentages measuring in double digits. American steel and aluminum enabled Soviet weapons production beyond what domestic supplies could support. American explosives supplemented Soviet ammunition production. American copper provided electrical infrastructure for relocated factories. The cumulative value of these deliveries totaled approximately $11 billion in 1940s currency, equivalent to roughly $180 billion in modern purchasing power. This represented material support on scale unprecedented in military history, exceeding the value of Soviet industrial production in multiple categories. Stalin's private statements about this aid differed dramatically from public positions. In classified meetings with Soviet military leadership, he acknowledges American supplies as essential to Soviet survival and victory. He credits Lend-Lease with enabling Soviet offensives from 1943 onward. He recognizes that without American trucks, Soviet artillery would remain largely immobile, that without American locomotives, Soviet logistics would collapse, and that without American aviation fuel, Soviet Air Force would operate at fraction of actual capability. During dinner conversation with Allied leaders at Yalta, Stalin offers a toast acknowledging American production's contribution to victory. He states, according to witnesses including Roosevelt's advisors, that the war was won through American production, British intelligence, and Soviet blood. The formulation acknowledges coalition reality while still emphasizing Soviet sacrifice as the decisive factor. But these private acknowledgments never appear in public statements or Soviet media. The narrative presented to Soviet population credits Soviet production, Soviet ingenuity, and Soviet strength exclusively. American aid receives minimal mention, and when acknowledged at all appears as minor supplementary support rather than fundamental enabler of Soviet military capability. Marshal Zhukov observes this contradiction with particular clarity, because his role as Deputy Supreme Commander requires him to understand both operational reality and political necessity. He plans offensive operations knowing American trucks provide the mobility, making those operations feasible. He reviews logistics requirements, understanding American locomotives must maintain rail transport for supplies to reach frontline units. He coordinates air support operations, knowing American fuel keeps Soviet aircraft flying. Yet when Zhukov addresses troops before battles, his speeches emphasize Soviet strength without mentioning American contributions. When he writes reports to Stalin summarizing completed operations, the language credits Soviet capabilities. When he speaks with foreign correspondents, he maintains narrative emphasizing Soviet self-sufficiency. Only in classified planning sessions does the reality emerge. Soviet military capability from 1943 onward rests on foundation of American logistics. This structured duality extends throughout Soviet military and political leadership. Everyone at senior levels understands the dependency. Economic planners calculate it precisely. Military commanders incorporate it into operational planning. Political officers enforce silence about it. The system functions through compartmentalization, acknowledging reality in contexts requiring accurate assessment while maintaining fiction in contexts serving political purposes. The consequences of this contradiction will shape post-war narratives for decades. Soviet historians writing official accounts of the Great Patriotic War minimize or omit Lend-Lease entirely. Veterans writing memoirs learn to credit Soviet production for equipment they knew came from America. The generation of Soviet citizens who fought the war carries memories contradicting official history, but learns to maintain public silence. June 1945, Victory Parade preparations, Moscow. The Red Army prepares to celebrate victory over Germany with massive parade through Red Square demonstrating Soviet military power. The formations include tanks manufactured in Soviet factories, artillery pieces Soviet workers produced, and soldiers whose sacrifices defeated fascism. The visual spectacle emphasizes Soviet strength and Soviet achievement, but the trucks transporting equipment to parade staging areas are Studebakers. The fuel-powering vehicles, comes from American refineries. The logistics enabling this demonstration of Soviet power function on American wheels, using American petroleum products transported on American locomotives. Stalin understands this irony, but sees no contradiction requiring resolution. Soviet sacrifice won the war. 30 million Soviet citizens died. Soviet cities burned. Soviet territory suffered devastation exceeding anything experienced by Western allies. That sacrifice deserves recognition regardless of what equipment enabled military operations, and acknowledging American logistics as essential complicates narrative emphasizing Soviet triumph through Soviet means alone. So the parade proceeds with American trucks carefully positioned out of camera angles. Newsreel footage shows Soviet tanks and Soviet soldiers without highlighting American vehicles in background. The victory celebration emphasizes Soviet achievement, while the American equipment that made much of that achievement possible remains invisible in official narrative. This pattern will persist for decades. Soviet military capability during World War II depended fundamentally on American Lend-Lease in ways Soviet propaganda never acknowledged and Soviet official histories consistently minimized. The trucks, locomotives, aviation fuel, and food transformed Soviet logistics from chronic weakness into operational strength. Without this transformation, Soviet offensives from 1943 onward would have proceeded far more slowly if they succeeded at all. August 1963, Moscow, Marshal Zhukov's apartment. Georgy Zhukov sits for interview with American journalist Harrison Salisbury, and the conversation turns to questions about Lend-Lease's contribution to Soviet victory. Zhukov has been removed from active command since 1957, following political disagreements with Nikita Khrushchev, and his relative isolation from power creates space for candor impossible during Stalin's lifetime. His response becomes the most direct acknowledgement any senior Soviet military leader ever makes on record about American aid's strategic importance. Without American production, Zhukov states, the Soviet Union could not have continued the war effectively. The Red Army would have lacked the mobility to conduct offensive operations. Soviet artillery would have remained largely static because no trucks existed to move guns forward with advancing infantry. Soviet Air Force would have operated at drastically reduced capability without American aviation fuel. The Marshal, whose offensives liberated Leningrad, destroyed German forces at Kursk, and captured Berlin, acknowledges that none of these operations would have succeeded without American trucks moving Soviet forces. Zhukov elaborates specifically on artillery mobility. The Red Army's doctrine emphasized mass artillery fires, concentrating hundreds of guns on narrow frontage to shatter German defensive positions. But concentration requires mobility. Guns must displace rapidly to exploit breakthroughs and maintain fire support for advancing infantry. Without American trucks, Zhukov explains, Soviet artillery regiments would have remained road-bound or dependent on horse transport, moving at biological speeds incompatible with mechanized warfare. The operational tempo achieved in offensives from 1943 through 1945 simply would not have existed. This interview receives limited circulation. American newspapers publish portions, but Soviet media ignores it entirely. Zhukov's statements contradict official Soviet historical narrative too directly for acknowledgement. The books and documentaries produced in the USSR continue emphasizing Soviet self-sufficiency and Soviet strength as sole factors in victory. Zhukov's admission exists in historical record, but remains outside Soviet public consciousness. Yet, Zhukov's statements represent acknowledgement of realities understood by an entire generation of Soviet military officers who planned and executed wartime operations. Every senior commander knew American trucks enabled Soviet mobility. Every logistics officer calculated supply requirements based on American vehicle capacity. Every front commander incorporated American equipment availability into operational planning. The dependency was so complete and so obvious that maintaining public silence about it required systematic, institutional commitment to structured falsehood. The archival documents from Soviet planning ministries, declassified decades after the war, reveal precise calculations of this dependency. Soviet economic planners tracked exactly which American supplies enabled which Soviet capabilities. They documented that Soviet truck production in 1943 to 1945 would have supplied perhaps 30% of actual requirements without Lend-Lease. They calculated that Soviet locomotive production could not have replaced combat losses and maintained rail transport capacity simultaneously. They determined that Soviet refineries lacked chemical processes to produce high-octane aviation fuel regardless of crude oil availability. These calculations remain classified because they demonstrated Soviet industrial inadequacy in critical categories. They showed that Soviet economy, despite heroic efforts to relocate factories eastward and increase production, simply could not generate sufficient logistics capability to fight mechanized war against Germany while simultaneously producing tanks, artillery, aircraft, and ammunition. American production filled gaps Soviet industry could not address, and those gaps included entire categories of equipment essential to modern warfare. The boots represent perhaps the most overlooked but strategically significant category. 15 million pairs of American boots meant Soviet soldiers could march through winter campaigns without suffering frostbite casualties that previously exceeded combat losses. The Red Army entered the war with inadequate footwear production, and first winter casualties from cold injuries reached catastrophic levels in some units. American boots solved this problem completely. By 1943, Soviet infantry advanced through Russian winter wearing American leather that kept feet functional in temperatures reaching -40 degrees. Food supplies similarly represent unglamorous but essential contribution. 5 million tons of American food meant Soviet soldiers maintained caloric intake sufficient for combat operations even as German occupation devastated Soviet agricultural regions. The spam that Soviet veterans remember decades later represented protein sources that domestic production could not provide in quantities needed to feed a 12 million-man army fighting across front measuring thousands of kilometers. These mundane logistics, trucks, boots, food, fuel, determined whether grand strategic concepts could translate into successful field operations. Stalin and his generals could plan brilliant encirclements and devastating offensives, but those plans required physical capability to move forces, supply ammunition, fuel vehicles, feed soldiers, and maintain operational tempo. American Lend-Lease provided that physical capability when Soviet industry could not. November 1987. Moscow, Glasnost-era historical reassessment. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms create space for more honest examination of Soviet wartime history, and historians begin publishing studies acknowledging Lend-Lease's importance more directly than previous Soviet works permitted. The official narrative begins shifting from complete silence about American aid toward grudging acknowledgment that Allied supplies provided useful supplementary support. This represents progress from previous position, but still minimizes actual dependency. Soviet veterans writing memoirs in this period describe their experiences with American equipment more openly. Tank drivers recall Studebakers that started reliably in cold that killed Soviet vehicles. Artillery officers remember American trucks that handled terrible roads without constant mechanical failures. Pilots discuss American fuel that enabled engines to achieve performance specifications. The accumulated testimony from participants contradicts official histories that minimized foreign aid's contribution. But even Glasnost-era reassessment stopped short of full acknowledgement. The narrative of Soviet strength defeating fascism through Soviet sacrifice remains too central to Russian national identity for complete revision. The truth emerges incrementally. Historians acknowledge American trucks were numerous, then acknowledge they were essential for specific operations, then finally acknowledge Soviet logistics depended fundamentally on American production. Each increment generates controversy and resistance from defenders of traditional Soviet narrative. December 1991, Soviet Union dissolution, archival access expansion. The USSR's collapse opens previously restricted archives to researchers, and the documentary evidence reveals dependency even more complete than Zhukov's statement suggested. The classified logistics reports show that by 1944, American vehicles constituted approximately 70% of Soviet truck inventory. Soviet domestic production focused almost exclusively on replacement parts for existing vehicles rather than new construction because factory capacity prioritized tank and self-propelled gun output. The railway statistics demonstrate similar patterns. American locomotives and cars didn't supplement Soviet rail transport. They replaced destroyed Soviet equipment and enabled the rail system to function at wartime operational tempo. Without American rolling stock, Soviet railways would have operated at perhaps 60% of actual capacity, creating logistics bottleneck that would have strangled offensive operations regardless of frontline capability. The petroleum data shows Soviet refineries produced adequate crude oil, but lacked cracking capacity to generate high-octane aviation fuel. American deliveries of 2.7 million tons of aviation fuel represented not supplementary supply, but essential resource Soviet industry simply could not produce. The Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovix and Yak fighters that dominated Soviet air operations from 1943 onward flew on American fuel because no alternative existed. These archival revelations generate debates among historians about how to characterize Lend-Lease contribution. Some argue the aid was decisive. Without it, Soviet Union would have lost the war or, at minimum, fought to stalemate requiring negotiated settlement. Others contend Soviet manpower and territorial depth would have eventually defeated Germany regardless, though timeline would have extended years longer and casualties would have increased dramatically. But the documentary evidence makes certain conclusions unavoidable. Soviet military capability from 1943 through 1945 depended fundamentally on American logistics. The offensives that liberated Soviet territory destroyed German military power, and captured Berlin, rolled forward on American wheels, using American fuel transported on American locomotives. Soviet soldiers fought with courage and died in millions. Soviet factories produced tanks and guns in quantities that matched German output. But Soviet logistics functioned because American production provided capabilities Soviet industry could not generate, while simultaneously fighting total war. May 1945 to December 1991, the 46-year silence. For nearly 5 decades, this reality remained officially unacknowledged in Soviet public discourse. The generation that fought the war knew the truth. They drove the trucks, wore the boots, ate the food, burned the fuel. But official histories minimized or omitted American contributions. Propaganda emphasized Soviet self-sufficiency, and institutional pressure maintained silence about dependency, contradicting narrative of Soviet strength. Stalin himself understood the contradiction with perfect clarity. In his final years, during private conversations with senior advisors, he acknowledged that American production had been essential to victory. He recognized that Soviet industry alone could not have supplied the logistics enabling successful offensive operations. But he also understood that acknowledging this dependency publicly undermined Soviet positioning as superpower rival to United States in emerging Cold War. The political calculation proved enduring. Soviet leadership from Stalin through Brezhnev maintained the essential fiction that Soviet strength alone defeated fascism. American aid received minimal mention in official accounts and, when acknowledged, appeared as minor supplementary assistance rather than fundamental enabler of Soviet military capability. 3 generations of Soviet citizens learned history emphasizing Soviet achievement while omitting American contribution. Only with Soviet Union's dissolution did full archival access permit comprehensive assessment of Lend-Lease's strategic importance. The documentary evidence confirmed what Zhukov acknowledged in 1963. Without American trucks, locomotives, aviation fuel, and food, Soviet military operations would have proceeded at dramatically reduced tempo, if they succeeded at all. The Red Army that captured Berlin in 1945 moved on American wheels, burned American fuel, and maintained supply through American rail equipment. 30 million Soviet citizens died defeating Nazi Germany. Soviet cities burned, and Soviet territory suffered devastation exceeding anything experienced by Western allies. Soviet soldiers fought with determination and courage that broke German military power. These truths remain undeniable and deserve recognition. But those soldiers advanced in American trucks. Their artillery moved on American suspensions. Their aircraft flew on American fuel. Their feet stayed warm in American boots. And for 46 years, official Soviet history maintained silence about these realities, because acknowledging them complicated narrative emphasizing Soviet triumph through Soviet means alone. The contradiction between operational reality and propaganda narrative represents one of World War II's most sustained institutional falsehoods. A dependency so complete that entire Soviet war effort from 1943 onward rested on American production, yet so politically sensitive that acknowledging it remained impossible for nearly 5 decades. Stalin knew, Zhukov knew, every senior Soviet military and political leader knew. The soldiers driving Studebakers through Poland and into Germany knew, and for 46 years they maintained silence about the American wheels that carried Soviet victory.